Hello, this is Mr. Mitchell. We have a video about the Harlem Renaissance, and on your Google Classroom you will find a note page that's a little bit different than the ones we've had lately. Here we're going to have topics that are covered on each slide. So for each slide, I will introduce the topic and tell you a little bit about it, and you'll need to take notes on what that topic was about. So you may need to pause the video if you're not sure that you've got the gist of what's on each slide. So one thing about the Harlem Renaissance is, well, I guess, what is it? How did it start? Well, it started with a great migration. In generations after the Civil War, many African Americans moved away from the rural areas of the South where many of their ancestors had been enslaved. So on your note page, you can have that explanation of what the Great Migration is. And on this slide, it says, why? Why was there a Great Migration? Well, some of it's pretty obvious. Number one, there was still that Jim Crow climate. You may remember we talked about that in many places in the South, for decades, there were poll taxes and separate facilities and literacy taxes, things that kept former slaves oppressed. So in that Jim Crow climate, from what I understand, many Southerners, Southern African Americans, just decided this was not worth putting up with. So they were willing to move to different places, and northern cities were often that place. Another possible reason for the migration were natural disasters. Around 1915 and 1916, there were a lot of natural disasters that hurt farming. So for those Southerners who did stay and farm, and their families farmed, around 1915 and 1916, there were some things that might have made them bankrupt, that those natural disasters reportedly led to people moving away into the northern cities. And one of the big reasons is post-Civil War industrial revolution. After the Civil War, primarily about 1880 and onward, there were these factories being built in these large cities, and there were suddenly lots of jobs, and these plants needed workers, and that lured some Southern black population to the large northern cities. Let's go to the next slide. So by the 1920s, you did have quite a number of people that had moved from the rural South to these cities, mostly in the North, but you can see on this slide out in the West. So over the span of about 50 years, it's estimated that 5 to 6 million people moved from the rural South into bigger cities away from the South. Harlem. New York City was one of several large cities that were the epicenter of the migration. Harlem, which is a borough of New York City, was an underpopulated, overdeveloped area. And by overdeveloped, that meant there were more housing than there were people. Speaking of housing, I mentioned that there were more houses in Harlem than there were people, and that drove the cost of renting or living in a house there down. So that was a big lure to people who were moving to New York City. So many migrating African Americans came to Harlem. Now, the Harlem Renaissance. We now have a population, a large population of African Americans who were in Harlem. From this population sprouted a golden age of culture, manifesting in literature, art, music, and stage performances. The Harlem Renaissance was the name given to this social, cultural, and artistic explosion. And you could probably say that it was between the end of World War I, which was 1918, and into the 1930s. New cultural identity is what came from here, or one of the many things. The literal artistic and intellectual movement kindled a new black cultural identity that had not been able to prosper in towns where their descendants were once slaves. On a sociological level, it helped redefine Black American culture. And to the rest of the world, it transformed the view of African Americans from rural, uneducated peasants to one of urban sophistication. So as a result, African American magazines like Fire, labor unions, and civic organizations sprouted up. This manifestation of the culture continued with poems and music and debate over common thought. And Harlem was that epicenter. I'm not sure if you remember from science, but epicenter is often used for the origin of an earthquake, and it's usually underground and spreads far and wide. So this was not just a Harlem Renaissance. It spread far and wide. While the cultivation of Black American culture wasn't just limited to the borough of Harlem, Harlem was the face of this Renaissance. And people from African descent from around the world even moved to Harlem to be part of this revolution. So, mention that the Harlem Renaissance went into the 1930s. Kind of the big reason for many things slowing down around that time was in 1929, the country fell into its worst economic hardship ever, the Great Depression. And the Great Depression reintroduced poverty and scarcity of food to daily life everywhere. And the Cultural Revolution of the Harlem Renaissance did slow down after this, but it did not stop it. And of many of the things we're going to see and read, they started in the 1930s or even after that. One could even argue that the redefinition of Black culture that led to the sophistication that was the image of Blacks at this point led to a fight for equal rights in the mid-20th century and beyond, and that African American refinement of art, writing, and music has really never slowed down since. And I hope you learned a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance.